Hello and welcome to another episode of this long-term close reading project of Thomas Mann's novel, The Magic Mountain. How does this project work? In each video, I will present a section of around about 30 pages of the novel, and I'm not going to repeat and give a summary of all what happens in this section, but I just present a very short summary of it in the beginning, and then I will share with you my observations. So about the narrative means, about the any cross-references to other texts, about the symbolic meaning of certain things mentioned in there. I'm sharing with you my observations and also my thoughts and my questions that came to my mind while reading this text. So in this week's video, we are talking about the second section of chapter 6. This section has the title, A Newcomer. So what happened so far in this section? Hans seeks distraction from his lovesickness, and he takes up his scientific hobbies again. He's particularly interested in botany and in astronomy, and as is the case when you're fascinated by a subject, you want to share your enthusiasm with others. So Hans tries to talk to Joachim about the scientific topics that he's currently dabbling in, and also a bit about the amateurish philosophical speculations that this triggers in him. But Joachim, a pragmatist who is always focused on practical life and on fulfilling his duties, he largely fails to understand Hans. But a remedy is at hand, because Ludovico is always eager to start a highbrow conversation, and he suddenly has a sidekick who is at least as witty as he's rhetorically gifted, his fellow lodger Naphta. So now the time has come. The casual stroll up the Magic Mountain is over. Now it's time to climb the steep cliffs. The arguments between Settembrini and Naphta, they are about to begin, and this part of the novel, I think it's dreaded by many readers of this novel. But don't worry, we'll get through it step by step. But first, let's take a quick look at the scientific topics that Hans deals with, and then we will dissect the verbal skirmish that Settembrini and Naphta are fighting out here and analyzing their attacks one after the other. So I've divided today's video into 7 sections. Number 1, Hans and his hobbies. Number 2, Settembrini versus Naphta, what's the point? And then we're going through a couple of topics that are discussed by Settembrini and Naphta. It's dualism, monism, and pantheism, the problem of universals, work or leisure, pacifism or war, and the ideal state or the ideal form of government. Okay, let's start with Hans and his hobbies. Spring or early summer in the Alps, in this mountain area in Central Europe. It's an absolute high time for botanists. There's an unparalleled variety of flowers to marvel at, as well as there are many plant species that do not occur in the lowlands, but they're really typical for this mountain area. But let's take a look at what Hans is actually doing here. I find the way that Hans devotes himself to his botanical studies very telling or revealing. When you're interested in flowers and find yourself in the Alps, you could be interested in very different subtopics in the field of botany, some very interesting ones, like plant physiology. So how do plants work? How does the uptake of water and nutrients by the roots work? How does the further transport in the various above ground plant organs work? And how and why do plants grow? So how does photosynthesis work? That's this process in which plants use daylight to then use this energy to synthesize such chemical compounds such as sugars and cellulose and other building blocks just from water and carbon dioxide. And how does all this work under the sometimes extreme climatic conditions in this mountain area? Or plant ecology. So how do plants interact with their animate and inanimate environment? What influence do local factors have on the viability and competitiveness of certain plant species? So factors such as the underlying rock and soil, the availability of nutrients and water, of light and shade, of frost and heat and wind, or symbiosis with other living organisms. Or a third topic of interest would be biogeography. So how does all this interplay of all the factors just mentioned here, how does this lead to certain distribution patterns of plants, or typical or sometimes even to precisely predictable combinations of or predictable annual successions of or seasonal successions of plants, of combinations of plants in certain types of environments. So these are all highly exciting subdisciplines of biology and botany that could be studied perfectly in the Alps, especially in this sort of mountain area where you have extremely different habitats for plants close to each other due to the differences in altitude and the impact on the microclimate. So, but what does Hans do? None of that. He deals with the most boring basics, in my personal opinion. It's interesting, like learning a phone directory by heart. He's dissecting plants for the sole purpose of determining their place in the botanical taxonomy system. So, in order to decide to which division or group or order or family or genus or species does this plant belong. So nothing wrong about having a system. So biology, a system has been needed and has been developed to bring a somewhat logical order to the vast number of different plant species. So plants, according to the system, can be grouped into distinct groups that are of plants that are more or less closely related. And so this is done primarily on the basis of their anatomical structure, in particular of the structure of their reproductive organs, so that's their flowers, and then similar or related groups with certain common characteristics can also be grouped together again at the next higher hierarchical level. And so this is what the narrator is talking about. It's these hierarchical level he is mentioning you when he talks about division and order and family and genus and species. Just as a side topic, incidentally, in this botanical system, taxonomy system, there are actually 7 main hierarchical levels in the botanical classification. Again, this magical number 7 that pops up everywhere in the novel. So let's take the example of the flower Soldanella mentioned in the text, or more precise, the alpine Soldanella. So this is actually the species level, Soldanella alpina, so the alpine Soldanella. And this species belongs to the more general genus of alpine bell, or Soldanella. So there are several species within this genus. And this genus belongs to the family to the Primula family, or Primulaceae. And this family belongs to the next hierarchical level, to the order of the heather family, so the Ericales. And this also includes the family of the tea shrub family, or the balsamine family, and so on. And then there's the class, the next higher level of the angiosperms, and then there's the division. The next higher level is vascular plants, and then above that, the highest level is the realm, or in Latin, regnum. So plants in that space. So that make clear they were talking about plants and not bacteria and not fungi. Okay, but let's get back to Hans. Why does Hans concern himself with precisely this boring aspect of botany? Dissecting, classifying, assigning plants their place in this dry classification system. I see this as a sort of a compensation mechanism for his confused mind. He is in inner turmoil. He is lovesick. He suffers pain from his separation from Claudia. So there's an inner emotional chaos. And Hans, in my opinion, is now trying to counteract this, at least in the outer world, through his actions, systematics, order, a neatly arranged structure, a system, assigning everything its proper place within that system. I think this may give him some feeling of control, or the feeling of having at least one aspect of life under control and at his own hands. I also find it symptomatic that what he does is actually, it's not science in the sense of creating knowledge. It's a purely archival, non-creative hobby of sorting objects he defines in his environment into a system that had already been created by others. And so there's nothing creative about this. And for me, in this hobby, also the two main themes of the novel, death and eros, they also resonate in this hobby and in the way it is described. Eros, because the whole classification system of plants is primarily based on analyzing their reproductive organs. And death, because with his herbarium, Hans is ultimately doing nothing other than creating a well-sorted morgue of plants, or a plant cemetery. It's a collection of plant cadavers or mummies. So meticulously labeled in calligraphy and with the Latin names, of course, which lends the whole thing a certain nobility. And yes, there was a time in Europe when, in order to be considered properly educated, you didn't have to understand much, as long as you knew the proper ancient Greek or Latin word for as many everyday objects as possible. But that's another topic. I'm getting sidetracked here. I also see this need for order that Hazens has. I see this also as a key feature in his second hobby. Just as in the microcosm of plant reproductive organs, of analyzing anthers, pollen, and ovaries, which can only be distinguished with powerful magnifying glasses, um, he, he is where he is mainly fixated on the classification of what he observes into a system. It's all the same with his observation of the macrocosm. When observing the stars and the planets in the sky, he is primarily interested in observing the structures of the so-called zodiac, so the structures which have been discovered and designated by the Chaldeans since time immemorial. So here too, the focus is not on discovering anything new, but it's on placing every object neatly within an existing traditional order and system. Okay, creating orders, that seems to be an urging need for Hans. By the way, I find it interesting that the planet Uranus is mentioned here by Hans as the example of a celestial body that was just discovered recently and had not been known to the Chaldeans. I think this is a rather strange choice, actually. If Hans is talking about naming an example of a planet that was discovered as recently as possible, then he should have picked Neptune. After all, Neptune was only discovered in 1846, but he names Uranus, which was discovered quite early, in 1781. However, a look at the Greek mythology quickly makes it clear why Thomas Mann chose this particular planet, Uranus, because Uranus in Greek mythology was one of the primordial gods, and together with the goddess Gaia, the earth goddess, he had several children. But he kept these children hidden or imprisoned in the underworld, in the Tartarus. But they didn't like it, so one of his sons, Kronos, the god of time, he took revenge for this, and he took a revenge in a cruel way by emasculating Uranus, that is, by cutting off the genitals of Uranus and throwing them into the sea. And however, Uranus' genitals did not just become fish food, but blood and semen mixed with the seawater and which foamed up, and from this foam in the seawater, Aphrodite was born. Hence her nickname, the foam born. And Aphrodite, and then he climbed on ashore, incidentally, at the beautiful island of Cyprus. So Uranus is the father of Kronos, the god of time, and the father of Aphrodite, the goddess of love and procreation. And so I think now it all makes sense. In this novel about Eros and above all about time, this is, of course, a much more appropriate planet to be mentioned than Neptune, for example. Hans also talks about the nature of time in his comments on astronomy. We have already looked at in this novel at time from different angles. We have noticed that time can be relative in several ways on a psychological basis. It may appear to us sometimes stretched, sometimes shortened, but it can also be relative in the real physical sense. So there's this effect of time dilatation as described by Einstein's theory of relativity. However, all previous statements about the nature of time had been based on a linear understanding of time. Time runs as if on a timeline, in a straight line, sometimes slower, sometimes faster, but ultimately always linear. And I think in the Western world for centuries, this had also been the prevailing understanding of time and of the way our history unfolds. But here, a completely different view of time is being taken. Time as something recurring, as something that runs in cycles, that is that repeats itself. And nowadays, it's more or less a commonplace that such a cyclical understanding of time and history was and probably still is more widespread in Asia, that is, in the Orient. In, in a couple of Asian traditions, time is not something considered linear and unidirectional, but as Hans put it, eternity turns out to be not straight ahead, but merry-go-around, merry-go-around. Or because it's the madness of the circle, an eternity without duration, in which everything recurs in sheer despair, if you like. And it is precisely this lack of direction, the predictable eternal return, which for Hans is also the cause of a deeply melancholic mood. He calls it tragic joy, triumphant sadness. That was what made our ancestors leap and exult around the leaping flames. Tragic joy, triumphant sadness, that's the English translation that I'm reading, but actually the German original uses the word melancholy here. So here in these few lines about Hans' astronomical hobbies, we again see the novel's central themes addressed beneath the surface: love and death, the nature of time, opposition of Western and Eastern thought, and melancholy. Okay, but now let's move on to Settembrini and Naphta. Let's start by taking a look at the way how Naphta's outward appearance is described. It's described to the reader as being of a piercing, one might say, corrosive ugliness. A hooked nose, a pursed mouth, pale grey eyes. It was to be expected that his speech would be incisive and logical. So all this points to a character tinged by coldness, by pinchedness, by radicalism, fanaticism. His hair was a metallic, colorless ashen blonde, smooth back. He was rather small and with a voice reminiscent of a cracked plate tapped on by the knuckle. That is a hollow, dead sound. He seems to be an alumni of a religious school, probably a Jesuit, but possibly also of Jewish ethnicity, and at least that is what Joachim assumes from Naphta's physiognomy. By the way, Joachim's comments here also a telling illustration of the widespread anti-Semitic resentment and cliche of that time. So, but what is all this dialogue about? Why do we have to deal with this dialogue, with this skirmish between Settembrini and Naphta? I think the point of this first battle of words is to leave both Hans and the reader completely perplexed and overwhelmed. It is not so much about the specific topics and the respective positions of Settembrini and Naphta. I rather have the impression that the narrator is staging a kind of rhetorical cockfight here in order to convey an impression of Naphta's character and in order to make the reader really feel Hans' confusion. Perhaps Thomas Mann is also showing a little bit off here about his own learnedness by making all these references to philosophical and political topics. Who knows? After all, he was human after all. But what's even more complicating the narrator, even complicating the situation for the readers to understand the whole discussion, is that the two debaters, they are obviously not interested at all in having a structured discussion where everything is discussed really in detail, in a comprehensive way, in which there might be a clear synthesis in the end, a sort of consensus or a compromise, or at least a clear joint gain in knowledge at the end. Maybe Settembrini is aiming for this type of discussion. It is also mentioned somewhere in the text that he had countered for the most part lightly, yet with a fine warmth in his tone, as when he urged their essential agreement upon certain fundamental points. But Naphta is not interested in consensus or compromise or synthesis or knowledge gain at all. He is the model type of what is known as a rebulist. He is someone who argues in a not sophisticated, sophistical, petty, opinionated manner, often distorting the true facts if need be. He stands really for splitting hairs in a figurative way, and for caustic, corrosive criticism of and the negation of everything. If you try to put together all the different positions that he has expressed in this debate, you will realize that his ideology is not a coherent worldview at all. It's made up of very heterogeneous, sometimes contradictory set pieces, sometimes communist, sometimes fanatical religious, sometimes fascist. So the common characteristic of his position is the negation of conventional values and thought patterns. It's the radicalization of his opinion to the extreme, to the radical, in both, in the opinions that he advocates for and in those that he vehemently rejects. And with his intelligence, with his rhetorical tricks, but also finickiness, he distorts every statement and opinion of his opponent into absurdity. And so he seems to be a purely destructive character with a completely unclear agenda of his own, or maybe his agenda is to be destructive, caustic, corrosive. This seems to be his own agenda. I think the most revealing is one short sentence that he drops in between. I quote the sentence: "To see the world as cleft into two opposing poles, that is spirit." And I believe that this sentence sums up his character and his intellectual program very well. It is through this lens that we can best understand and classify his statements and his intentions. To see the world as cleft into two opposing poles, that is spirit. So, um, if you don't want to dig deep, you can leave your understanding and analysis of the debate between the two at this general level of understanding, and let the details of the dialogue pass you by. I think this is still quite enough and sufficient in order to understand the novel. But for those who want to delve a little bit deeper into the structure and the themes of the argument, I think it's interesting. It's a treasure trove of exciting topics from the field of humanities and philosophy that are touched here. So let's take a look at the topics one by one. The first topic is, I would call it dualism, monism, and pantheism. So what are these strange words? Settembrini uses the weather as a somewhat conventional opener for the conversation. So he talks about the cool and clear spring weather without any haze or fog, without mist. So that's just right for him. He loves clarity above all. So, and Naphta immediately begins mockingly and leads the conversation to the question of the relationship between material or tangible nature on the one side and the spirit or the divine on the other side. And this brings up right into the core questions of philosophy and religion and the difference between these three strange things like dualism, monism, and pantheism. And so what is it all about? In essence, I think this moves in circles around the following questions. So if there is a sort of supernatural transcendent power, a higher being, or let's call it a god or a world spirit. So if there is such a thing, is it something that is opposed to the material nature? So is it in contrast to the material nature? That would be the position of dualism. Or is this transcendent power a part of material nature, or vice versa? The whole material nature is just a part of the divine whole. Are they just one? This would be the position of monism. So if you express this idea in strictly philosophical terms. So, and here we are very close to the thoughts of Schopenhauer, for example. You may remember my 12th video about Hans' scientific hobbies, and when I explained the basic ideas of Schopenhauer, what Schopenhauer calls the will. I think this could be understood as a monistic basic principle behind the world. And so that's a philosophical point of view. If we look at this basic principle behind the world more from a religious point of view and consider it being some sort of divine entity, then a god, then we are talking about what we call pantheism. So material nature and the divine are one, because the divine or God is in everything, and everything is in the divine and is by the divine. So all the phenomena of the material world are just different manifestations of the one divine entity or basic principle. So that's, in a nutshell, the position of dualism, monism, and pantheism. And why is this important? I think depending on how you position yourself on this issue, either on the side of dualism or monism or pantheism, that may have an impact on your world view, on your understanding of the world, of your understanding of religion, of society, and your own relation with these entities. So, for example, let's talk about religion. So if the world is something created by a god, but still something separate from God, perhaps even that has been detached from him or separated in a sort of catastrophic event, and so now there is the need of redemption or reconciliation. So that would be a sort of religious dualism. And a classic example would be Christianity, or also the other two Abrahamic religions, Judaism and Islam, where dualism exists not only between the world and God, so there is a need for reconciliation or atonement, but a second level dualism exists also within the realm of the transcendent beings. There again is a dualistic division into a good and an evil power, a creative and a destructive one. God, may call it God and the devil. So counterexamples, so from the field of religion, would be many strands of Buddhism, and many of which can be considered a variant of monism, because it manages without gods or deities. Or some varieties of Hinduism, where there are also three, in one of its variants, three main gods: Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, for example. But these three are ultimately only seen as three different manifestations of one overarching single deity, the Trimurti, which contains all three elements: the creative element, its corresponding manifestation is Brahma; the sustaining element, its corresponding manifestation is the god Vishnu; and the destructive element or power, and its corresponding manifestation is Shiva. And creative, sustaining, and destructive, and we are in the circular thinking. It's a circle it's moving. It's a merry-go-round: creation, sustaining, destruction, and so on. But we can also go further. So what impact does monistic or dualistic thinking have on our worldview, on how we consider society, for example? So I think it makes a difference whether we focus on emphasizing what we have in common, or on emphasizing what divides us. So does one see a community, a society, a state primarily as a unit, as a collective we, or primarily as a kind of forced marriage of hostile groups. It's us against the others. So Naphta is completely on the side of the hard, extreme dualism. For him, matter and spirit are two different, even opposing things. And also the mind is also a dualistic thing between divided between good and evil. And, and this polarizing, divisive thinking runs through all the topics on which he gives his opinion. Let me remind you of his statement. To see the world as cleft into two opposing poles, that is spirit. Or a more literal translation of the German original would be seeing the world as divided in a hostile way, that is spirit. Okay, let's move on to the second topic of this conversation. It's again a major philosophical topic that is touched on. It's namely the so-called problem of the universals. This is also relatively early on in the discussion when there is a brief argument about Aristotle and the nature of things, and medieval philosophers such as Thomas of Aquinas and Bonaventura are mentioned. And so what is this problems of universals about? This is an age-old topic in philosophy. The two essential opposing basic positions were already formulated and represented by Plato on the one hand and Aristotle on the other hand. And through the Middle Ages and into modern times, the spectrum of positions was enriched by a wealth of modified and intermediate and more extreme positions. So, but what is it all about? What is at stake here with this problem of universals? It's basically a similar topic to the question of dualism and monism, a very fundamental one. The core question in this universals problem is, do ideas and terms and concepts, do they exist as such, completely detached and independent from whether the world exists and whether we humans exist as thinking beings? Are these ideas nevertheless existent, eternal, and real? So I'm talking about ideas such as true, false, round, square, justice, freedom, God. So Plato was of the opinion that these ideas exist independently of us, and so they are real, and therefore this position is also known as realism. So that these ideas are real entities, even in an empty universe or without a universe, they exist or they will exist. And the opposing position, which his pupil Aristotle already advocated, is, in simple words, these ideas are products of our human mind. They are something that we have derived and abstracted from the observation of our world, to which and now we have created these ideas and we have given them a name. So that's why this this position is also called nominalism, because we named it, we gave it name to these things. So we are the ones who created and named these ideas. And in the early and high Middle Ages, this problem of the universals was the hot topic of philosophy, a philosophy which at that time was predominantly theological in nature. It was mostly done by theologians. And from this point of view, it's also understandable why this was such an important idea or such a key problem. So the question of whether God or even a concept such as the Trinity is real, or it's just an idea created by humans. This was of fundamental importance for the church, for the understanding of orthodoxy, but also for the justification of the church's authority and power. And this is why the theological philosophers of the Middle Ages were predominantly supporters of the realistic position and were keen to justify this position in a philosophically plausible way. And incidentally, the problem of the universals is in no way settled today. It's neither solved nor dead. Although it no longer has this explicitly theological impact, um, it's important for in other areas as well. And prominent representatives of both fundamental schools or positions are still represented in contemporary philosophy and the philosophy of law and also in mathematics. For example, let's stick with math. In math, it's an interesting question. Do triangles, points, prime numbers, or numbers, any number, or do they the binary formulas, do they exist independently of us? So does a number one, a number two, a number three, does this exist? Has it any meaning independent of us? Or are these, they exist independent of us, and are these so just concept that the mathematicians do not create, but they just discover or unveil it? Or are these concepts or entities that do not really exist in a world without humans, but they are only constructs of the human inventions, of the human mind, things that we have thought up, created, and named? Okay, let's move on to the next topic. There's this topic of work and leisure. Which one is the highest good? Or for those who prefer a more humanistic approach, using the ancient Latin vita activa or vita contemplativa, which is morally superior. Indifferent and want less leisure, or an active life in the service of a noble goal. And it's not surprising that the humanist Settembrini, um, a dyed-in-the-wool disciple of the Enlightenment, and someone who, through his literary works, wants to help reduce suffering in the world and to promote democracy and freedom. That this Settembrini is a great advocate of an active life, of vita activa. And of course, Naphta must be in opposition to this and consider the exact opposite to be desirable, leisure. And then Settembrini's response or objection that this is really an Oriental mentality, and Naphta has another objection or contradiction ready. He defends this mentality by being actually something of Western culture, and this is something he called quietism or quietism. I don't know how to pronounce it in English. A Western invention, and this is a part where he refers to Fenelon and Molinos as representatives of quietism. And in a nutshell, what was quietism? It was a theological movement in the 17th century that was particularly popular in France, Italy, and Spain. And the core idea was that those who had truly come to the knowledge of God, um, they no longer needed the usual ritual activities such as prayer or receiving the sacraments, or striving for virtue or asceticism, etc. The final consequence would be that they don't need neither priest nor church. And it's therefore not surprising that this movement, quietism or quietism, was condemned by the church as heresy. And Molinos, mentioned by Naphta as an example, he was sentenced to eternal imprisonment. His writings were burned and placed on the index of books forbidden by the church. And it is therefore also quite telling that Naphta, an alumni of a church school, is someone strongly influenced by the church, he suddenly uses a theology condemned as heresy by the church as an argument in his favor. And so this nicely illustrates his contradictory nature and his main motive, which was, again, primarily to provoke division and contradiction rather than to develop and defend a coherent position. Then a sort of a subtopic here is the work of the monks. And this is the topic that immediately follows. And here becomes very clear what a turncoat Naphta is. Having just sung the praises of quietism, now he defends the hardworking monks. But then here again, he contradicts all conventional interpretation and says, oh, it was completely unsocial in character. It was the most unadulterated religious egoism. It was useful to the monks out of self-interest, and it did not stem from a humane idea in the sense of a benefit for the general public. So this is what Naphta means by the difference between the useful and the humane. And here again, NAFTA is creating division through the insinuation of unfair, of selfish motives. Next topic. Next topic is touched upon when Hans mentions that Joachim is going to be a soldier. Then the topic turns to war, or more precisely to the contrast between pacifism and the bourgeois acceptation of life on the one hand, and the desire for war on the other hand. And Settembrini praises the idea of peace in Europe, which he sees on the rise, and he praises the liberal democratization movements in Turkey, and NAFTA immediately intervenes again. He considers these positive developments to be rather short-lived, and he conjures up a catastrophic scenario. Unfortunately, it has to be said that in the long term, NAFTA was right. The situation really led to the catastrophe of the First World War. I can only briefly outline here the specific political world situation that what was at stake in 1908 when Settembrini and Naphta had this conversation in the novel, and the things that are briefly referred to by Settembrini and Naphta provide a bit of context, because they're only just providing fragments and snippets and half sentences in their discussion. At that time, 1908, Turkey, or rather the Ottoman Empire, was a weakened state. And now various European powers were trying to secure influence in this power vacuum. For the German Empire, the Ottoman Empire was an important trading partner, and attempts were made to maintain or increase the German influence in the Ottoman Empire, for example, but also stabilizing it by helping to modernize the Ottoman army, for example. And this was naturally a thorn in the side of Russia and England, which is why the two, Russia and England, came closer together, even though they also had different interests in that area. Russia had just lost a war against Japan, and thus lost lots of its influence in Asia. So it was important for Russia, both domestically, for the economy, and also for its international reputation, for Russia to expand its power in the Balkans and in the Ottoman Empire in return. So Russia now wanted more influence in the Balkans, while England primarily wanted to secure the status quo in that region in order to avoid that any other political power gained too much power and leading to an imbalance here. So the situation even between the two powers, Russia and England, was not free of conflict either. But what united them were their common enemies. So the German Empire and its ally Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary was in direct competition with Russia in the Balkans, above all by annexing Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1908. And then other complication was the Brenner border. Italy was a bit more on the side of Germany and Austria, but there was this conflict between Italy and Austria because they both claimed the province of southern Tyrol for themselves. So this was the complex and complicated and conflict-ridden political situation the summer of 1908. And unfortunately, it has to be said that it was not the pacifistic and optimistic Settembrini, but the cynic Naphta who was ultimately proved right that this conflict situation would lead to a huge conflict, to World War I a few years later in 1914. But the moral reprehensibility of Naphta is once again made clear by one sentence. So, what is politics for then, if not to give both sides a chance to compromise themselves morally? I think one can hardly conceive a greater contrast to Settembrini's attitude, who sees politics as a means of improving the situation of humanity and of reducing the suffering in the world. So for Naphta, it's all about compromising each other, or this political power play. Moving on to the next or final topic, there's a somewhat naive interjection from Hans about the circularity of the movement that leads to the next topic of conflict between Settembrini and Naphta, and that is the ideal form of government, or the ideal state. And here the two opposing poles are, on the one hand, progress towards the national state, oriented towards Rousseau's ideas of the Enlightenment and the ideals of international law and natural law, or on the other hand, a global theocracy and oriented towards jus divinum, that is, to divine right, and governed by the hierarchy of the church. And if necessary, also brought about by war. Because, according to Naphta, I quote, war is the means against everything and for everything, for the sake of education and even against the decline in birth rates. Again, pure cynicism. At this point, the first dispute or argument between Settembrini and Naphta breaks off, but it becomes very clear what we can expect also in the future. A rhetorical battle with sharp weapons and a quick battle with quick moves, because the two of them disagree on almost all ideological issues, especially because Naphta deliberately sets out to always take the opposite position, in line with his credo, to see the world divided in a hostile way. That is spirit. So, and this attitude makes his views seem sometimes contradictory and incongruous, which also Hans notices and remarks to Joachim after the conversation. So, well, this section was a bit challenging, especially because the rhetorical exchanges between Naphta and Settembrini were always so lightning fast and quickly jumped from one topic to the next without really explaining in detail what's it all about. But I think we picked it apart quite well overall, and also understood what kind of character this Mr. Naphta is. I hope you have enjoyed this small analysis of this dialogue between Settembrini and Naphta. Let me know in the comments. I would be happy to discuss with you about it. And yeah, I hope to see you in a week or two if we talk about the next section in this chapter. I think it's about the divine state, or something like that is the title of the next section. And until then, have a great reading time. Take care. Bye-bye and ciao.